The last thing Luke Carter expected when his sleek black Mercedes slid off the icy road was to end up staring at the weathered sign of a roadside diner in the middle of nowhere. The blizzard had come out of nowhere, turning the highway into a slippery death trap. His GPS had failed, his phone had no signal, and now his car was buried in snow, refusing to start. He cursed under his breath, pulling his coat tighter around him. This was not how his weekend was supposed to go. He was a millionaire, for crying out loud. Things like this didn't happen to him, or so he thought. The diner's door jingled as he stepped inside, a gust of icy wind following him. The warmth hit his face immediately, along with the tantalizing scent of coffee and freshly baked bread. It wasn't much, just a handful of mismatched tables and chairs, a long counter with a row of cracked vinyl stools, and a single chalkboard menu hanging on the wall, but it was a refuge. "Take a seat wherever you'd like," called a voice from behind the counter. A woman appeared, wiping her hands on a towel. She was younger than he'd expected, her auburn hair tied up in a messy bun, her cheeks flushed pink from the heat of the kitchen. She wasn't like the women he was used to, polished, poised, and draped in designer clothes. No, she had a natural beauty, the kind that didn't need makeup or expensive jewelry to shine. "I don't suppose you have a mechanic on duty?" Luke asked, his tone clipped as he tried not to shiver. The woman raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching as if she were holding back a laugh. "You're about 20 miles from the nearest town, so no, I don't have a mechanic on duty, but I do have coffee. Want some?" Luke hesitated before nodding. He slid onto one of the stools, brushing the snow off his coat. The woman poured him a steaming cup of coffee and set it in front of him, her eyes studying him curiously. "You don't look like you're from around here," she said. "What brings you out in this mess?" "Business," he replied shortly, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong and surprisingly good. "I was driving to a meeting upstate. In this weather," she gave him a skeptical look. "Bad call," Luke bristled. "I didn't exactly plan for a snowstorm, did I?" The woman shrugged, unbothered by his tone. "Well, you're lucky you ended up here. That storm's not letting up anytime soon." "You're better off waiting it out." "Great," Luke muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. "Just great." She leaned her elbows on the counter, a small smile playing on her lips. "You've got a real cheerful attitude, don't you?" He glared at her, but she didn't seem intimidated in the slightest. If anything, she looked amused. "Do you talk to all your customers like this?" he asked. "Only the grumpy ones," she shot back, her smile widening. "I'm Hazel, by the way, and you are—" "Luke," he said reluctantly. "Well, Luke," Hazel said, straightening up. "If you're planning to stick around, I've got some soup on the stove and a spare room in the back. It's not the Ritz-Carlton, but it beats freezing to death in your car." Luke blinked, caught off guard by her offer. "I don't need charity," he said stiffly. "It's not charity," she replied, her tone matter of fact. "It's common sense, but suit yourself." She turned and walked back into the kitchen, leaving Luke to stew in his own thoughts. He glanced out the window, watching as the snow piled higher and higher outside. He hated feeling powerless, and right now, he was completely at the mercy of the storm and, apparently, this infuriatingly kind stranger. A few minutes later, Hazel returned with a bowl of soup and a plate of bread. She set them in front of him without a word, then busied herself cleaning the counter. Luke stared at the food, his stomach growling despite himself. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and he wasn't about to let pride stop him now. He picked up the spoon and took a cautious sip. It was delicious, rich, and hearty, with just the right amount of seasoning. "This is good," he admitted grudgingly. Hazel glanced at him, her expression smug. "I know." The hours passed slowly, the storm showing no signs of stopping. Luke tried to distract himself by checking his phone, still no signal, or flipping through an old newspaper he found on the counter. But his eyes kept drifting back to Hazel, as she moved around the diner, refilling coffee cups and chatting with the handful of other stranded customers. She had an ease about her, a warmth that seemed to draw people in. It was disarming. By the time night fell, the diner was empty except for the two of them. Hazel locked the door and turned off the neon open sign, then grabbed a set of blankets from a closet in the back. "Come on," she said, nodding toward the spare room. "You'll freeze out here." Reluctantly, Luke followed her. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed and a tiny heater in the corner. Hazel handed him the blankets and gave him a reassuring smile. "Get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow's a new day." Luke watched as she walked away, her footsteps soft against the creaky floorboards. For the first time since the storm hit, he felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was the exhaustion catching up to him, or maybe it was something else entirely, but as he lay down and closed his eyes, he couldn't help but wonder about the woman who had taken him in without hesitation. Who was Hazel, really? And why did he feel like his life had just taken a turn he hadn't seen coming? The sound of a door creaking open woke Luke. He sat up abruptly, disoriented for a moment until the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the diner, Hazel. He ran a hand through his tousled hair, realizing the faint scent of coffee had wafted into the room. He stepped out, still groggy, and found Hazel behind the counter, pouring herself a cup. She was dressed in a different sweater today, oversized and cable knit, and her hair was once again tied in that effortlessly messy bun. She glanced up as he approached, a teasing smile already forming. "Morning, Mr. Sunshine," she quipped, holding up the coffee pot. "Coffee?" Luke grunted a response, sliding onto the same stool he'd occupied the night before. She poured him a cup and handed it over, her fingers brushing his briefly. It was unintentional, but it jolted him awake in a way the coffee couldn't. "Storm's still going," Hazel said, nodding toward the frosted-over windows. "Looks like you're stuck here for another day," Luke groaned. "Fantastic," she chuckled softly, leaning her hip against the counter. "I'll try not to take that as an insult." He smirked despite himself, taking a sip of the coffee. "What do people even do around here when they're snowed in?" "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "some of us don't have million-dollar meetings to get to, so we make do. Card games, baking. Shoveling snow when it gets bad enough. You could always help me out in the kitchen." He raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like someone who belongs in a kitchen?" "Not particularly," she admitted, her gaze roving over his tailored shirt and expensive-looking watch. "But you don't look like someone who belongs stranded in a diner, either, and yet here we are. Touché." Before Luke could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and an elderly man shuffled in, stomping snow off his boots. Hazel's face lit up. "Morning, Walt," she greeted warmly, already reaching for a mug. "Morning, Hazel," the man replied, his voice gravelly. His eyes flicked to Luke, and he gave a curious nod. "Got yourself a guest, I see." "Yep," Hazel said, her tone light. "Luke here got caught in the storm. He's staying till it clears." Luke gave a polite nod, feeling oddly out of place as Walt settled into a booth. Hazel moved with ease, chatting with him as she poured his coffee and took his breakfast order. Watching her, Luke couldn't help but notice how different she was from the women in his world. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't calculating her next move or angling for something. She was just herself. And for some inexplicable reason, that intrigued him. When Hazel returned to the counter, she set down a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Luke without asking. He stared at it, then up at her. "You're really big on unsolicited hospitality, aren't you?" he said dryly. "Eat," she ordered, ignoring his sarcasm. "You'll need your strength if you're going to survive another day of doing absolutely nothing." He couldn't help but chuckle at her audacity. "You know, you're kind of bossy for someone who runs a diner." And you're kind of grumpy for someone who probably has more money than God, she shot back, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Luke froze for half a second, his fork hovering in midair. What makes you think I have money? Hazel shrugged. Your car, your watch, the way you carry yourself. You've got rich guy written all over you. Maybe I just have good taste, he countered, but she wasn't buying it. She tilted her head, studying him. Maybe, she said slowly. But if I had to guess, I'd say you're used to people doing things for you. Used to getting your way. Am I wrong? Luke's jaw tightened, though her tone wasn't accusatory. If anything, she sounded amused. He decided to deflect. What about you? What's your story, Hazel? She blinked, clearly not expecting the question. My story. Yeah. You run this place by yourself, for the most part, she said, leaning on the counter again. It belonged to my parents. I took over a few years ago after they retired. Retired to where? Florida, she said with a small laugh. They send me postcards every month, rubbing it in. Luke smirked. And you stayed here. Why? Her expression softened as she glanced around the diner. Because this place matters to people. It's not flashy or glamorous, but it's home, and I like helping people. Even grumpy strangers who don't say thank you when you feed them. He rolled his eyes but couldn't stop the smile tugging at his lips. Thank you. See, that wasn't so hard, she teased. The day stretched on, the storm relentless. Luke found himself surprisingly entertained by Hazel's company. She roped him into helping her stock shelves in the back, claiming it was character building. He grumbled the whole time but secretly didn't mind. She had a way of making even mundane tasks feel enjoyable. By late afternoon, the diner was quiet again. Walt had left, and no one else had braved the storm. Hazel was wiping down tables when Luke spoke up. You ever think about leaving? He asked, his voice casual. You know, seeing what else is out there. She paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. Sometimes. But then I remember that the grass isn't always greener. Besides, this place is mine. I built a life here. Luke nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He envied her in a way. She had something he didn't, a sense of purpose, of belonging. His success had brought him wealth, but it hadn't brought him peace. That evening, Hazel cooked dinner, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, and they ate together at one of the booths. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside, the warm glow of the diner's lights made it feel almost cozy. You know, Hazel said as they finished, you're not as bad as I thought you'd be. Luke raised an eyebrow. Gee, thanks, she laughed, the sound light and genuine. I'm serious. You could have been a total jerk about all this, but you've been tolerable. High praise, he said dryly, but his lips twitched in a smile. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge. Hazel cleared her throat and stood, breaking the spell. I should clean up, she said, grabbing their plates. Luke watched her retreat to the kitchen, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. He told himself it was just the circumstances, the storm, the isolation, the novelty of being in a place so far removed from his usual life. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Hazel wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. And for the first time in a long time, Luke found himself wanting to know someone not for what they could offer him, but simply for who they were. The next morning, Luke woke to the sound of quiet voices and the faint clatter of dishes. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and glanced at the tiny clock on the nightstand. It was barely past 7, way earlier than he typically started his day. But there was something about the diner's hum of activity that pulled him out of bed. When he stepped into the main room, Hazel was standing by the counter, chatting with a young woman who looked to be about 18. She wore a puffy jacket and carried a box of canned goods. Hazel laughed at something the girl said, her head tilting back, and Luke couldn't help but stare for a moment longer than he should have. Look who's finally awake, Hazel teased when she noticed him. Thought you might sleep through the rest of the storm. Luke smirked as he slid into a stool at the counter. I didn't realize this place came with a wake-up call. It doesn't, she replied, pouring him a cup of coffee, but it does come with breakfast. Pancakes okay? Pancakes are fine, he said, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd had them. His usual breakfast was a protein shake or a quick bite at his desk. The young woman by the door gave Luke a curious glance before turning back to Hazel. Need anything else brought in from the pantry? No, thanks, Katie, Hazel said. You're a lifesaver. Katie smiled shyly, her cheeks pink from the cold. She gave Luke one last look before heading out the door, leaving them alone in the diner. Is she your sister or something? Luke asked, watching as Hazel moved effortlessly around the kitchen. Nope, Hazel replied without looking up. She's Walt's granddaughter. She helps out sometimes when he can't. Good kid. Luke nodded, watching as she flipped pancakes with practiced ease. So you've got the whole town running through here. Hazel shrugged. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everyone. You'd hate it. Why do you say that? Because you strike me as the kind of guy who likes his privacy, she said, sliding a plate of fluffy pancakes in front of him. Am I wrong? Luke didn't answer right away. She wasn't wrong, but there was something about this place that felt different. He wasn't sure what to make of it yet. As he ate, Hazel leaned against the counter, sipping her own coffee. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze drifting toward the window where the snow had finally started to let up. The light streaming in made her hair glow like fire, and for once, Luke found himself at a loss for words. What's on your mind? He asked, setting his fork down. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around her mug. It's just, the snow's clearing up. You'll probably be able to leave soon. Luke blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected weight in her words. He hadn't even thought about it yet. He should have felt relieved, but instead there was a strange heaviness settling in his chest. Yeah, he said slowly. I guess I will. Hazel nodded, forcing a small smile. Well, I'm sure you've got important places to be, fancy meetings, big deals to close. Her tone was light, but there was something in her eyes that betrayed her. What if I don't want to leave? The words were out before Luke could stop them. Hazel stared at him, her lips parting slightly in surprise. What? I mean, he said quickly, backpedaling, what if the roads are still bad? Maybe I should wait another day just to be safe. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Luke, you're not exactly the type to stick around a place like this. Don't feel like you have to, I'm serious, he interrupted, his voice firmer than he intended. I'm not in a hurry. Hazel studied him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what game he was playing, but when she didn't find any trace of a joke, her expression softened. Well, if you're staying, you're helping. I've got a supply truck coming later and those crates don't unload themselves. Luke smirked. You're really milking this whole stranded in a storm thing, aren't you? Absolutely, she said with a grin. Now finish your pancakes. By midday, the snowplows had started clearing the roads, but Luke stayed true to his word. He helped Hazel unload the supply truck, his leather gloves doing little to shield him from the biting cold. Hazel worked beside him, her cheeks flushed and her breath visible in the icy air. You're not half bad at this, she said as they carried the last crate inside. Careful, Luke replied, setting the crate down with exaggerated care. You might ruin my reputation. Hazel laughed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Don't worry, you're still the grumpiest guy I've ever met. Luke chuckled, shaking his head. He didn't know how she managed to get under his skin so effortlessly, but he found himself enjoying it more than he cared to admit. As the afternoon wore on, Hazel insisted on teaching him how to make her famous cinnamon rolls. Luke fumbled his way through the process, earning more than a few laughs from her as he accidentally spilled flour on himself. You're a natural, Hazel teased, her eyes sparkling with amusement. Remind me to add pastry chef to my resume, Luke deadpanned. Though he couldn't help but smile, by the time the rolls were in the oven, the diner smelled like heaven. Hazel leaned against the counter with a contented sigh, her gaze drifting to Luke. "You know," she said softly, "you're not as grumpy as I thought you'd be." Luke met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them. "And you're not as bossy as I thought you'd be." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. They stood there in the quiet warmth of the diner, the snow outside forgotten for a moment. Luke didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Hazel had become more than just the woman who'd helped him out of a bad situation. She was something else. Something he wasn't ready to define yet, but couldn't ignore. That evening, after the diner had closed for the night, Hazel surprised him with a bottle of wine she'd been saving. They sat in one of the booths, the world outside muffled by the snow. The wine was cheap, but neither of them seemed to care. "To unexpected detours," Hazel said, raising her glass. Luke smirked, clinking his glass against hers. "To bossy diner owners, grumpy millionaires," she shot back, her eyes twinkling. They laughed, the sound filling the empty diner. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Luke felt happy. Not the fleeting kind that came with closing a deal or buying something expensive, but a deeper kind of happiness. The kind that came from being exactly where you were meant to be. As the evening wore on, their laughter faded into quiet conversation. They talked about everything and nothing, their walls slowly coming down. Hazel told him about her parents, about how they'd poured their hearts into the diner and how she'd taken it over to honor them. Luke shared pieces of his own life, the parts he usually kept hidden. The pressure, the loneliness, the feeling that no matter how much he achieved, it was never enough. "You're not what I expected," Hazel said softly, her eyes searching his. "Neither are you," Luke replied, his voice equally quiet. They sat there for a moment, the air between them charged with something neither of them dared to name. And then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Luke leaned in. Hazel didn't pull away, their lips met in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative. But then it deepened, growing more urgent as all the unspoken feelings between them spilled over. When they finally pulled apart, Hazel's cheeks were flushed, her eyes wide. She started, but Luke cut her off with another kiss, this one full of certainty. "Don't," he murmured against her lips. "Just don't," and for once Hazel didn't argue. The next morning, Luke stood by the window of the spare room, watching as sunlight glinted off the snow-covered fields. The storm had passed, leaving behind a serene, untouched landscape. His car, barely visible under the mound of snow, now seemed like a distant reminder of the life he knew, a life that felt strangely out of place here. He stepped into the diner, the smell of coffee and cinnamon greeting him like an old friend. Hazel was kneeling by the front door, replacing the weather-beaten welcome mat. Her cheeks were rosy, likely from the cold air that still seeped through the cracks. "Morning," Luke said, his voice softer than usual. Hazel looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "Morning. Sleep well?" "Well enough." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I was thinking about sticking around a little longer." She blinked, clearly surprised. "Luke, the roads are clear now." "You don't have to stay." "I know," he said quickly, "but I want to." His eyes locked with hers and the weight of his words hung in the air. "If that's okay with you." Hazel straightened, brushing her hands on her apron. "Okay, sure, but why?" "Don't you have, I don't know, a million places to be?" He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "For once, I don't. And honestly, I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be right now." Her lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she gave a small nod, her expression a mixture of confusion and something softer, something hopeful. "Well," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if you're going to stay, I'll have to put you to work again." Luke chuckled. "Deal?" Later that afternoon, Hazel was wiping down the counter when the bell over the door jingled. She looked up to see Luke stepping in after brushing snow off his coat. He wasn't alone this time. He carried a large brown paper bag in one hand and a small bouquet of wildflowers in the other. "What's this?" Hazel asked, narrowing her eyes suspiciously as he approached. "Dinner," Luke said simply, setting the bag on the counter. "And these are for you." He held out the flowers, their delicate petals a stark contrast to the rugged man handing them over. Hazel stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. "Luke, you didn't have to do this." "I know," he said, his voice steady. "But I wanted to." She took the bouquet, her fingers brushing against his. For a moment she just stood there, staring at the flowers like they were the most precious things she'd ever been given. "Thank you," she said softly. "Don't thank me yet," Luke said with a grin. "You haven't tasted my cooking." Hazel raised an eyebrow. "Wait, you cooked, sort of," he admitted. "I found a gourmet market in town. They helped me put it together." She couldn't help but laugh. "Of course they did." Luke smirked, pulling takeout containers and a bottle of wine from the bag. "You'll be impressed, trust me." They sat at one of the booths, the table between them laden with roasted chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, and roasted vegetables. Hazel poured the wine, her movements careful and deliberate. When she handed Luke his glass, her fingers lingered just a second longer than necessary. "This is really nice," Hazel said, her voice softer now. Luke watched her, his gaze steady. "You deserve nice, Hazel." Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked down at her plate. "You're full of surprises, you know that?" "Good surprises, I hope. The best," she admitted, her eyes meeting his once more. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the quiet hum of the diner's heater filling the gaps. But as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow through the windows, Luke set down his fork and leaned back. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious now. Hazel glanced up. "About what? About this place? About you?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I've spent so much of my life chasing things: money, success, this idea of what I thought happiness was supposed to be. But being here with you, it's the first time I've felt like I could just stop. Like I could actually breathe." Hazel's breath caught in her throat. She set her glass down carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "Luke, I know it sounds crazy," he continued, his voice earnest. "We barely know each other, but I do know this: I want to be here, with you. If you'll let me." For a moment, Hazel didn't say anything. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but there was none. He was completely, undeniably sincere. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "Say yes," Luke said simply. "Say you'll give me a chance." Hazel smiled then, a small, shy smile that made his chest ache. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now. "Yes, I will." Over the next few days, Luke became a fixture in the diner. He helped Hazel with the morning rush, his clumsy attempts at pouring coffee earning him more than a few laughs from the regulars. He shoveled snow from the walkway, restocked shelves, and even managed to fix the squeaky hinge on the kitchen door. But more than that, he and Hazel fell into an easy rhythm, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. They shared quiet moments over cups of coffee, their conversations ranging from light-hearted banter to deeply personal confessions. And every time their hands brushed or their eyes met, it felt like the world around them faded away. One evening, as they were closing up, Luke pulled Hazel aside. "I have something for you," he said, his voice low. "What is it?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Hazel's eyes widened as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold bracelet, its surface dotted with tiny diamonds that sparkled in the dim light. "Luke," she breathed, her hand covering her mouth. It's too much." "No, it's not," he said firmly, taking her hand and slipping the bracelet onto her wrist. You've given me more than you realize, Hazel. Let me do this for you. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. Luke cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the stray tear that escaped. You're beautiful. And then he kissed her, a kiss that felt like a promise. By the end of the week, Luke knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He had to tell Hazel the truth about who he was, not just a stranded traveler, but a man with a life far removed from hers. A millionaire with responsibilities and expectations waiting for him back in the city. But when he finally told her, sitting across from her in their favorite booth, she didn't react the way he expected. You think I care about that, she said, her tone almost exasperated. Luke, I don't care how much money you have or what you do for a living. All I care about is the man who's been here with me, the man I've fallen in love with. Luke stared at her, his heart pounding in his chest. You love me, Hazel smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. Yeah, I do. A slow, radiant smile spread across his face. I love you too, Hazel, he stood, pulling her into his arms. I'm not going anywhere, he said, his voice filled with conviction. This is where I want to be. With you. And as Hazel looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, Luke knew he had finally found what he'd been searching for all along, a place to belong, a person to love. A future worth fighting for, together.